So why doesn't hip internal rotation get any respect? And I think one of the reasons is because we've confused or we've equated the picture on the left with the picture on the right. So a lot of times, we see this a lot with the low back too, where we look at loaded movement through the same lens as unloaded movement. So there was a lot of research done a while back about how, for example, loaded flexion or loaded flexion and rotation is the mechanism for a disc herniation in the lumbar spine. And I think the researchers made that very clear that loaded movement was kind of or loaded movement under load was the culprit for some of these injuries. And then some people extrapolated that and took it out of context and said, well, we should never round our lumbar spine. And so you had this crowd that was like, even if you're hovering over your sink to brush your teeth, you should brace yourself and do a hip hinge and all this stuff. And it's kind of like everything became this really high threshold strategy, and to the point where people were afraid to round their low backs at all, even when they weren't under load. And so we've kind of taken this whole barbell mentality and equated it to unloaded movement. And I think the same thing has kind of occurred with hip internal rotation. Hip internal rotation, like lumbar flexion, has gotten a bad rap because we've heard a lot about knee valgus and, that being the mechanism for ACL injuries. So kind of under more dynamic loaded conditions, like when someone's running, cutting, and jumping, you don't want to see a lot of IR. And I would argue that even IR under those conditions isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's what happens below the hip that could be more problematic. So once again, it's an example of taking something out of context and making these broad generalizations. So I would argue that hip internal rotation is not a bad thing. It's something that needs to be assessed. It needs to be trained because it's very important. So like I said, the barbell has redefined what's functional, and we've kind of equated function, especially in the performance community, with loaded movement. So Olympic lifting, squatting,